watching Captains of Industry here on CNBC Africa, and I'm chatting to MD Ramesh, who is President and Regional Head of Southern East Africa Olam International. Ramesh, thank you very much for your time. Firstly, let's just talk about the Olam journey and the traction that the company has across the African continent.
Morning, Bronwyn, and thank you for having me. Olam has been in Africa since 1989, and we began our business in Nigeria, starting with the export of cashew nuts. The original promoters were looking to set up a business that would help them generate foreign currency for some of the needs of their current investments at that time in Nigeria. But our current CEO and the co-founder of the business had slightly different ideas. The name Olam itself was coined with that view in mind. So Olam in Hebrew means without boundaries. And as we've seen over time, in 27 years, we are in 70 countries across 18 platforms, 47 products, and pretty dominant in the industry that we are.
Many sitting here will say, what is the key to success when operating in Africa?
It's a question we get asked all the time. And in my experience of 25 years in Africa with Olam, I can't remember another company with our kind of footprint. The first thing is, I think, when we entered the industry, that was a time when a lot of the government parastatals that used to control the commodity businesses were being liquidated and privatization was setting in. So a large number of users of agricultural commodities who used to depend on their relationships with these parastatals had no choice but to look for somebody else, because what was left of the industry at that time was not wholly reliable. And what we did was set up a network of buying arms with the farming communities and developed a very reliable, we think cost-effective and a highly efficient network that ensured that all the procurement of agricultural commodities were done of the right quality, at the right time, at the right price, and delivered to the end users.
So Ramesh, I've just come back from the African Development Bank annual meeting, which was held in Ahmedabad, India. And the focus of that forum was agriculture and the role that agriculture has to play in the driving growth across Africa. There is a disconnect between what many perceive as subsistence farmers and the actual business of agriculture. How do you think we're going to fast track? I mean, we've got 60% or 65% of the uncultivated arable land here in Africa, which means that we can well become the breadbasket of the world if we get this right. But there's still that disconnect. Can you give me your thoughts on how we go from the perceived subsistence to agriculture industry?
On the face of it, the equation is frankly so much in favor of Africa. Like you said, 60% of the world's arable land, a lot of land water. 1 in 2 of the world's farmers reside in Africa. And the equation is that about 65 to 70% of Africans are dependent on agriculture. About 20% of the world's population is dependent on agriculture. If you do the numbers, it works out that approximately 1 in 2 farmers reside in Africa. So with those kind of equations, it makes sense to believe that we have the right climatic conditions, we have the right soil conditions, we have the water, we have the people, we have the land. The issue is putting it all together. And while some of the countries outside Africa, and one in Africa being South Africa itself, have actually built a large industry around farming, there are very few countries in Africa and very few businesses in Africa that have actually made large-scale farming a success. The fact is that to succeed in Africa, we will have to live with and work with small-scale farmers, and that's what Olam does. So we have grown our business responsibly through our interface with farming communities who we know need financial support, need market support, need understanding support, need practice support, which means how do they do their farming well. And the biggest challenge that Africa faces of converting all these very attractive numbers is that we don't get the yield that we are supposed to get.
Well, to that point, we import $35 billion, and that's a net figure of food on an annual basis when we're sitting with all this arable land.
Absolutely, and that's a challenge that we have to overcome in the very near future. $35 to $40 billion worth of agricultural commodities, of which 80% is the big five: maize, rice, sugar, wheat, and edible oils. no African plate for food is complete without at least 2 or 3 of them, and therefore all of that is currently imported. We have the climatic conditions to actually make all of these go away. We need to correct our yields, and the farmer who continues to work his 12, 15, 18 hours on his farm is just not producing enough so the bang for the buck is not good enough.
Come back to Olam and how you are changing the equation, and perhaps it's very difficult to speak about Africa with one brush. So choose a territory that you feel you're making the most impact in, and give me an indication of how that is happening on the ground, so to speak.
Right, you put it very correctly. There is no Pan-African strategy. You have to go country by country, depending on the markets, depending on the soil conditions, depending on the land availability, depending on the land policy, the approach can be different. Our view is that the biggest thing that the African farmer lacks to be productive is that first, the quality of the seed that he's working with. Frankly, most of the seed that we are working with in Africa are generations and generations past their use by date. The support that he needs in terms of implements, fertilizer, chemicals, weedicides are either unavailable or just too expensive. The weather conditions and water, let's assume for a minute, is okay. The third thing is agricultural practices. Lastly, for generations, the African farmer has struggled with the fact that when he needs the finance to make agriculture a sensible business proposition, the finance is not available because the financial institutions are just not there.
They are not lending to the farmer at the
or
end.
they're just not there. You're right. They're not lending and they're not there. So a poor farmer has to come all the way, sometimes 200 kilometers, sometimes 500 kilometers to the nearest bank. And most of our financial institutions don't understand the farming language and are unwilling to take that risk. Okay. So what Olam brings to the party is this. We first started by providing them finance at the right time, providing them the implements and tools that they need, then providing them best agricultural practices. Some of the way we communicate this can be quite crude, but we are now talking of villages which are sometimes 200-300 kilometers from the nearest.
And the complete lack of infrastructure, in some instances a lack of energy.
Yes.
In fact, most instances a lack of power.
Yes, absolutely. So we have to find the best solution for that particular terrain where possible. In the Ivory Coast, I must give you a good example of how about 80,000 hectares of cotton farms with about 100,000 plus farmers. What we have done there is something that we have done in other parts of the country, but the real result and the real difference is that African average for cotton yields is approximately 300 to 400 kilos per hectare. South African cotton farmers, just by the way, produce about 3 tons. So that's the difference. In Ivory Coast, we have taken those outturns of 300 to 400 kilos now to over a ton in the land we work. So the same farmer, different seed, different implements, different practices, produces 2.5 times what he used to produce earlier.
And that's the start of turning a subsistence farmer into a businessman, because he has additional product or produce to sell.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then once you make him wealthy, he can then decide whether he wants to send his children to school, wants to dig up toilets, wants to open a hospital. That's his call. Our job is to make him wealthy and make the business proposition interesting so that he comes back next year and plants again.
The other discussion point at the African Development Bank annual meeting was that agriculture is the easiest way to achieve inclusive growth across the African continent, simply because of the numbers that you quoted earlier, in that the majority of the African population is reliant on agriculture for their livelihood. Let's go back to Olam and the business and your vision for the next 5 years, because if this environment is heating up and agriculture is going to take center stage, then players like yourself are certainly going to be highly in demand, specifically when it comes to engaging with African governments.
We are of the belief that first, agriculture is a long-term game. Number two, that it will require a good mix of corporate farming like we do in some parts of Africa, as well as working with small-scale farmers so that communities grow with us. We farm currently on 2.8 million hectares of land across Africa. Not all that land is owned by us, but we are not in the real estate play. We are in the farming play. And as long as the land is protected and can grow crops, we are happy with that. In most cases, we work with the small scale farmers. In some cases where we have a corporate farm, we work with a nucleus farm where we do modern farming practices and the farmers around us become our support system.
scale is crucial, and I'm assuming that that is part of your model, is that you take individual farmers in these little farms, small holdings, and you aggregate and help them create scale that they can then effectively enter markets and provide timelessly.
Absolutely, absolutely. Without scale, I think there is no future in agriculture. It becomes interesting for us as a business only when scale and size is available. Africa can provide that scale and size. There are about 33 million farmers approximately in Africa, and the average
is that across the continent?
Across the continent. Remember, these are all approximate numbers because there's no real census done. We engage with about 3 million farmers in Africa and about 4.5 million farmers across the world. At any point in time, these 3 million farmers could have between $150 to $200 million of advances, $200 million of advances sitting with them. No banking institution in Africa takes that kind of a risk. Our risk is taken on the basis that we have a system, we have the right people, we have the right interface, and we have great relationships with these farming communities built over 20-something years, where there is a mutual value creation understanding. So we create value for them by improving their yields, giving them better practices. They create value for us by giving us a larger crop back. So we give them the market, we give them the finance, they give us back the crop. And this relationship is an ongoing relationship for over 20 years. That's why we believe this business is sustainable and we can grow on this model.
So 25 years at Olam, and clearly you're passionate about agriculture. What has led to your journey at this point?
I'm passionate about Africa. I'm passionate about agriculture in Africa because of two reasons. One is that, without doubt, this is the land of opportunity. I have lived in Europe for about a year and a half, setting up a business for Olam somewhere in the late 90s. And with all due respect, I must say that the kind of opportunity that I see every day coming to me in Africa, in different parts of Africa, I didn't see that thrown at my face in Europe, number one. Number two, I think the changes that I've seen in Africa over the last 25 years only fortify my belief that we are going right. Governance has changed, governance has improved. The lot of the small scale farmer, wherever we have had interactions, have significantly improved.
Is that a result of regulation? Do you think that there's active regulation to improve the plight of the smallholder farmer?
I believe if governments are willing to give us a level playing field, responsible players like us can find a business logic. And the business logic that exists can be unearthed and encashed only when we are sure that we are playing on a field where everybody else has the same rules. So if policy is consistent, I think we can find the way to do business.
But a lot of players across the continent who are trying to do business will say to you that their number one concern is the fact that policy isn't consistent. Do you share that view?
No, I don't share that view. There may be the odd pockets where there is inconsistency in policies and off and on changes happen, and we have faced some of them as well. But in general, I would believe that all those days are behind us. 25 years back, the possibility of leadership taking somewhat arbitrary calls existed. I think it is 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 now. Bulk of it is still fair and easy to work with.
Fair to say that you're an Afro-optimist.
Absolutely, absolutely, wholehearted.
Your leadership style, how would you define it?
I must say that Olam has been a great teacher in managing leadership and developing leadership, on account of the fact that the nature of a business is such that most of us are thrown out in the open into the deep waters, and we have to learn to swim by ourselves.
An entrepreneurial culture.
Absolutely. And the entrepreneurial culture is developed on account of the fact that this is the nature of our business. I must say that our founder and current CEO has been a benchmark in this. I have seen him being the CEO of a 6-man, 8-man startup with a $5 million top line, to what he is today at $20 billion. And he has constantly kept the pace of development and learning, that pressure on all of us, because he's so much ahead of the curve. And the organization is happily following up on his paths on account of superior thinking that he brings to the organization, new practices that he's able to imbibe, and therefore kept us all on the learning mode. So we are constantly looking for new learning, and seeing how we can get better in one of the oldest industries in the world.
So the founder has developed your own leadership style.
100%. He has been a great role model, and we have learned that first, having a great point of view of the future and having a unique point of view is hugely helpful in setting up an ambitious business target. The critical word in Olam that we use often is persuasion. So it is our role as leaders to persuade our teams to understand where are we headed and why are we headed the way we are headed. When we do that, we get complete buy-in of the enormous energy that the organization possesses.
Talking about enormous, you have an enormous portfolio as President and Regional Head of South and East Africa. How do you keep the balance, and how do you manage to be present with your teams on the ground? Do you travel constantly rather?
I travel about 20 days a month, but I must say that I have learned from my experiences that the only sustainable way to have successful businesses is to have crack teams. Choose the right people, nurture them, grow them, give them the right amount of freedom so that they can perform and they see the same value that I see in the role that I play, and then our goals are aligned. Once our goals are aligned, their natural creativity will take over and they'll be able to perform.
Do you have nationals in each territory, or do you deploy people from South Africa into your East African territories?
We find the best talent possible for each role that we have in place, and the drive is to find as many as possible local talent in the countries that we operate, but we are completely agnostic about that. So I have Zimbabweans working for me in Australia, I have Zimbabweans working in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. My rice farmer in Nigeria is a South African. So we are completely agnostic.
The other thing that I'm very interested to understand is how the progress through the East African community and the leadership that we've seen in that region, how that has changed your operating model. But by all accounts, if you look at the African Development Bank's economic outlook for Africa, the East African community grew by some 5.4% in 2016, certainly leading the way.
Without doubt, East Africa is now leading the pack, but you will recognize that that's a new trend. West Africa was taking the bulk of the growth platforms in the past. In the recent past, two things I think have driven East Africa. One is that there is a growing recognition of the fact that there is a significant amount of population in most of these countries, and that can be interesting for any consumer-driven company. Number two, the high quality talent that East Africa is able to generate. So there are Kenyans and, like I said, Zimbabweans.
That free movement of goods and services and people is really starting to take a hold in the East African community. Is that making a difference for your business?
I do believe that of the blocks that work together across Africa, whether it's ECOWAS, whether it's East African community, we could get better there. I think you know that only 9% of the African trade is intra-Africa trade. Logistics is only one challenge. Clearly there's a challenge, but that's only one challenge. The other challenge is that these blocks don't work as efficiently as they should. The big boys still want to be a bit more selfish than they should be.
So even the East African community isn't working as effectively as it should?
Not yet. Not yet.
Is it better than the other regions?
It is better than the other regions in many respects. The Kenyans and the Tanzanians recently have had some difference of opinion, but that has a history as well. But I must say that between Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, the movement is very smooth and it works well.
Ramesh, your biggest challenge as you sit right now, 2017, and you look forward, what keeps you awake at night?
We are a well-invested business on this continent, and we are easily Africa's largest agricultural business, about $1.9 billion invested already with greater plans coming up. My biggest challenge is that a lot of the investment that is on the ground needs to come good, because most of them, like I said earlier, are long-term assets. And
so you've got to have patient capital. This has been patient capital.
That's correct. This has been patient capital, but that's the nature of the beast, and we have to work with that. I can't get a coffee plant to grow in 2 years when it takes 6 years to grow. So my challenge is to ensure that I have the right people at the right place, backing all the investments that I've made, to be sure that these investments come good. We are sure that when we took the bet, that it was a good bet. We're now hoping that we'll actually see it in figures.
In terms of your competitive landscape, are there players that are starting to encroach on your territory, and how do you stay ahead of the curve?
The world is a small place, And in every country, we have competition, different in nature, different in investment, different in appetite. We are of the view that it's good to have competition because it keeps us on our toes. Number two, it speeds up the learning curve for all of us. I though must say that there's not a single competitor that we have on a pan-African basis. We are in 25 countries. Not a single competitor is across the continent. The Dangote group has made lots of promises for the agricultural business, and they're doing quite well. On the East African side, we have the Bakriza group that does a lot of wheat milling, and they have significant assets in some parts of in East Africa. They are doing very well as well, very well managed business. The export trading group has got a reasonable footprint across Africa.
But really, from a scale perspective and from that pan-African presence, you are dominant in this space.
By far. In terms of the land that we farm on, in terms of the farmer engagements we have, in terms of the assets we have, in terms of the investments we have, we are at a completely different scale.
I want to get a little bit more personal now, and for all those entrepreneurs who are watching and all those who actually want to embark on successful corporate careers, because it sounds as though your career at Olam, the 25-year history, has been a combination of entrepreneurship and of corporate citizenship, so to speak. What is your advice to young people starting out, knowing that we have the youngest population, we will soon have the youngest population globally? Those that want to follow in your successful footsteps, what do you say is the key to success?
To begin, I would like to say that I'm lucky to be in an organization where I have the backing of a huge corporate that allows me all the entrepreneurial freedom that I would need if I was running my own business. So it's a fantastic combination.
It sounds like a dream
for
any entrepreneur to have that security of the corporate backing.
Absolutely. I can take a bet and they'll be willing to back me. And if I go wrong, well, it's a learning, and don't do the same thing again, and let's move on. That's how we operate. The other thing is that because we are a corporate that operates with a purpose, it's good to see that we make a difference. And we've been making a difference for this 27 years we are here. I can see how lives have changed, crop sizes have changed, country development has been impacted, and we are operating
that inclusive growth
yes,
that I was speaking about
absolutely.
earlier is starting to happen.
Yes, and we've been seeing it for a very long time. And the mutual value creation model works very well for us. Now, having said that, I must say that the driving passion that most of us in my organization have, and that increases the engagement quotient of the entire organization's teams, is, I think, the singular difference between us and a lot of other organizations. Our attrition rates are so low simply because people just love what they do. And in some of the more difficult locations, people are there and they continue to work and they continue to stay focused on account of the fact that, like me, they believe they make a difference in the organization and in the communities. They believe in Africa, they believe in the long-term play, and we give them all the freedom to do what they want to do. So finding your passion, I think, is a critical aspect. Second thing is, be sure that however talented, however educated you are, there is no substitute for hard work. Those 15 hours, 20 hours that you put in. But when you're passionate about something, those 20 days that I travel, it takes no toll on me. I'm fit, I enjoy what I do, I use the travel sensibly.
They say when you're passionate about something, it's actually not a job, it's a hobby.
Absolutely. You're not going to work anymore.
I don't want to stop you there because you were on a roll. If you could give your 26-year-old self some advice now, what would that be?
My advice to myself would be behavioral. And behavioral on account of the fact that we must recognize in our lives that not everybody is equally gifted, equally talented, or comes from similar circumstances. The capacity to recognize those differences, respect them, and work with them would be far more profitable than trying to bring them along the lines that you would like. And that's what experience has taught me in 25 years. I've lived with so many communities, I've worked with so many communities who are different, come from different backgrounds. Had I recognized this that early, I think I would have been far more profitable than I am today.
One more element that I want to get from you, and again it's advice, because right now there's so much uncertainty around the African continent, and many investors are very nervous about continuing to deploy their hard-earned money into the African context. You clearly have said you're an Afro-optimist, and you can hear it in the conversation that we've had. You're passionate about agriculture. What is your advice to those people that are hesitant about the Africa opportunity right now?
Bronwyn, the scenario has not changed so much. Even when I started doing business, the large businesses that used to depend on Africa for their sourcing or their markets like to stay out of it. I think a lot of learning has happened in the meantime where mistakes have been made. But I think the critical aspect of success for doing business in Africa, A, is to have long-term partnerships. There are African businesses like the ones that we have also developed in our 27 years, small and medium enterprises, lots of entrepreneurial energy. Finding the right partner, getting into a long-term partnership, helping him understand and you yourself understanding that this is a long-term stay. You will have bad days, you will have good days, but go through with it. And I think that can spell success for lots of investors who are looking to invest in Africa.
Ramesh, it's been an absolute pleasure. You've been watching Captains of Industry here on CNBC Africa, and I've been chatting to MD Ramesh, who is the President and Regional Head of South and East Africa Olam International. Thanks for joining us.